going to begin by saying a big welcome to Armando, who has been to the club before. He came to lunch back in February when we welcomed him as an honorary member. And we're very pleased to do that. And you all know, in case anybody's forgotten, that Armando kind of, well, one of the things I'm going to explore with you, Armando, is that you were doing a PhD on Milton at Cambridge, I think. Is that right?
At Oxford.
At Oxford, I beg your pardon. At Oxford. And then you abandoned it to take up a career in comedy. Isn't that right?
Yes. Yes. I mean, I always was obsessed with comedy from quite a young, from about the age of 11 or 12. I was a huge radio comedy fan, and listened to things like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It was one of my favorites. So I was obsessed with comedy. And while at school and at university, I was at Glasgow University and then at Oxford, I would spend my time when I wasn't being academic, writing and performing. So it wasn't a sudden decision to go from Milton studies to comedy. It was one of those things I'd always been balancing my mind. I think when I finished my undergraduate degree, I always thought comedy wasn't really a career. And when you're at university, you're under terrible pressure to have a career. So I sat the civil service entrance exam, and I nearly made it all the way through to the Treasury. And at the very last interview at the Treasury, they said, "We think you won't take this seriously." And they were right. And so I got a reprieve from being in charge of the poll tax and instead became a comedy producer, which I think was the right thing.
Yes, yeah. I think it probably was. I think we're all glad you did.
Yeah. It would have been a very funny tax. It would have been a funny tax rather than the tragic one that it eventually became.
What became tragic?
The tax. If I'd been in charge of the poll tax, I would have made it funny.
Yes, poll tax. No, well, yeah. No, there weren't many laughs in the poll tax.
No.
But listen, is there something happening here? Have you gone all literary again by moving into David Copperfield? Are you going to film Milton next?
No, it's unfilmable. I mean, it would just look ridiculous. Satan and the angels and so on. I think you'd have to do some kind of animation or something. No. I always, until recently, I'd always done my own projects. I'd always generated my own shows. So like the Day-to-Day and the Thick of It and so on. Although the Thick of It was meant to be fictional, but we can go into how fictional it was and wasn't. But I just got, as I was rereading Dickens, which, I'd always done since I was about 12, 13. I'd always been struck by how funny he was. And we have this terrible, I think, notion of him as being this long-winded Victorian novelist who writes about mud and fog and death and misery. And yes, he does, but he also writes about life, and he's very, very funny. And when I was rereading David Copperfield about 10 years ago, I was struck by how modern and contemporary it felt as a novel, really, because it's all about these terribly modern things like status anxiety and imposter syndrome, because it's 800 pages of David Copperfield wondering who he is and whether he fits in and whether he's made the right friends and made the right life decisions, and the people he comes into contact try and shape him in their image and so on. It's all about poverty and wealth existing side by side in the streets of London. It's about mental illness with Mr. Dick, played by Hugh Laurie in the film, who I think Dickens has given us the very first humane treatment of mental illness and called mental illness in English literature. It's not seen as just eccentricity or madness. It's seen as an illness. It's seen as something that, Mr. Dick has to kind of carry as a kind of trauma. So for all these reasons, and because it is in the end about a writer who, rather like me, is spending most of his life going, I don't know what I am. and then discovering sort of in the middle of his life, oh, I think I'm a writer. I think that's what I've been doing for the last 30 years. I might as well call myself that. It sort of appealed, really. So, but I have no plans to kind of, do Middlemarch next, or, the Barchester Chronicles or anything.
No, I mean, you say Milton's unfilmable. I'm sure you're right. Although perhaps, yes, animation, but
Yes.
but perhaps not. I wasn't seeking to guide you towards Milton. Do you think, I mean, are there some writers, well, I'm sure there are, but I'd like your thoughts on it, who are more filmable than others? I mean, if we think of Jane Austen, for instance.
Yes.
I don't know whether you're a terrific Jane Austen fan, but it's a completely different thing. They make wonderful films, but they're sort of period soaps. They're nothing like the novels, which are so wonderfully subtle, and everything is in the writing and in the sort of internal deliberations that each character.
Yeah, well, what I wanted to do with the film was, I mean, you've touched on something that I found with lots of period adaptations, in that they are very reverential about the plot. They want to tell you the story that's told in the book. And what gets thrown out because there isn't time is the language, the metaphors, the imagination, the play. And I found with Dickens, especially with David Copperfield, this was a book about memory and imagination. Never mind the plot, everyone kind of knows the story, and, we don't have to go through all that again. What I think hadn't been kind of conveyed really was just the sheer joy in writing, in coming up with inventive ways of describing and observing, and the power of imagination to go back and dig into your childhood memories and try and turn it into something other than just a kind of point by point account of things that have happened. So that's what I wanted to do. I also wanted to make a film that people could go to having no knowledge of David Copperfield or Dickens or the period, and just watch it as an entertainment. If they left it feeling, oh, I must go and read some Dickens, or I must read about the time, or I must look at other adaptations, then great. But for me, it's principally, I approach it as a filmmaker. I want to make this as a film. What is it about it that for me is the interesting thing? And also, as opposed to doing it as a TV show, I wanted people to feel they were watching a life being lived. And I think you can only do that in one continuous sitting, to get that sense of the rhythm of the life and things that you saw at the beginning to kind of towards the end having fresh impact and so on. So that's what I did, and we had a great time. It came out in the UK January and February. In fact, when I saw you at the club, I think it was it'd been out for about 3 or 4 weeks, and I was all set to start taking it out across Europe and internationally and so on. But circumstances events, dear boy, cropped up, and all cinemas shut all around the world, and only now are we gradually beginning to kind of look at possibly opening it up. I think it opens in Australia today. America, it's officially there to start in cinemas on August the 14th, but goodness knows what's going to happen in America. It's sad to see, really, a country like that just so devoid of any kind of leadership, really, and everything so up in the air. But anyway, that's where we'll be. Anyway, we've got Super Spreader Saturday to look forward to tomorrow. I hope everyone's going to go out and super spread.
That's passed me by. What's Super Spreader Saturday?
Oh, of course it is. I was being flippant about.
Yeah.
I was being flippant about this ghastly pandemic.
Yeah. Super Spreader Saturday, and for us, Super Love Monday.
Yes.
So I hope everybody, by the way, I hope you've all noticed that the club is behind me. I am in the smoking room of the club. I won't sadly be able to join some of you who will be coming here on Monday, but I can assure you that preparations are well underway, and the club will be fully functioning. Let me get back to Armando. I think it's really interesting how you're your oeuvre has developed. I know you were talking to Stephen Sacker earlier, and I'll give a little plug for Stephen Sacker, shall I? Because if anybody wants to hear more Armando, go on to BBC iPlayer and catch his interview with Stephen Sacker, which I saw this morning on Hard Talk.
Yes.
But as we were saying, that was quite serious.
Very frightening title, that.
Yes, yes, Hard Talk.
Yeah.
You're not the sort of typical guest for Hard Talk, are we? Are you? But so, because you've moved a bit from satire into literature with Copperfield, and I wondered if you want to do more of that. And are there other authors you've got your eye on?
No, I mean, I'm very fond and always have been of Graham Greene, and there haven't been that many good. I suppose Our Man in Havana is probably the best Graham Greene adaptation. I mean, he himself wrote screenplays, but I love his novels. I think they're terrific to read on a kind of wet lockdown, because they're only about 200 pages, most of them. But his writing and his ability to take really chewy moral issues and put them in the middle of quite a good yarn is admirable. So Graham Greene interests me. I haven't really seen a good screen version of The Power and the Glory, for instance, or Ministry of Fear, which is a one that I'd recommend. So possibly there, but I don't actually think ahead as to, things take me by surprise. The Copperfield took me by surprise. The only reason I did Copperfield was I found myself doing The Death of Stalin prior to it as a film, which again was something that was offered to me. It started life as a French graphic novel, would you believe? And I had been thinking about doing something about a fictional dictator, looking at the rise of autocracy authoritarianism around the world, Putin and Erdogan. This was before Trump had arrived on the scene. Maybe even people like Berlusconi, the kind of, these figures, these populists who rise and start twisting the rules and start bending the law and so on in order to kind of using the media, manipulating it to kind of, whose main kind of raison d'etre is to stay in power. And that's it. That's their policy. Please, I want to stay in power. Vote for me. Which is what Putin did yesterday in his referendum. So I was looking at a fictional version, and I got sent this graphic novel, The Death of Stalin, and I thought, well, there it is, all laid out. I mean, it's tragic and yet hysterical at the same time. The kind of absurdity, the fact that people lived in fear of just saying the wrong thing, but no one quite knew what the right thing was to say until they looked around them to see what everyone else was saying.
And you quite like paranoia, don't you?
I like paranoia.
Because paranoia is ridiculous as well as
terrorism. Oh yes, I think there's something. Well, it's interesting. As we were researching The Death of Stalin, and we went out to Moscow and spoke to people who grew up under that regime, they talked about joke books, these Stalin joke books that people exchanged, and lots of jokes about Stalin, really grim jokes. And you could be shot if you were heard telling one, but people felt the need to turn it into humor, almost as if to say, he may take my family away, my freedom away, my possessions away, he may lock me up, but if I can still make a joke about him, he hasn't shut my brain down. And people who came to see the film afterwards, who had been through that experience, said to me, it's funny, but it's true. And it's true because it's funny, and it's funny because it's true. I mean, that's what we all knew was absurd at the time. That's the thing. Nobody, all this idea of how authority can try and, brainwash people into, it doesn't seem to work, really. I think people are fundamentally much more immune to that kind of, thought manipulation. Because it's remarkable, isn't it, that when any regime falls, millions of people are suddenly come out onto the streets and have thrown off the beliefs that they were told to have for the last 15 or 20 years. So it's interesting, I think.
Isn't China a bit of a challenge, Armando? What do you make of Hong Kong and China's.
Yes, I mean, that's very depressing, I think. Very depressing.
Xi Jinping, I mean, he's apparently, there are concentration camps for weeks. I mean, it's horrible,
Yes.
horrific. I mean,
and also our attitude to China, which is so complex now because because governments are no longer feel comfortable seeing China as the enemy or villainous, because so much of our economy is dependent on China. I mean, China very quietly for the last 15, 20 years have been buying and investing their way into economies all around the world. It was interesting. I was in St. Lucia about 7 or 8 years ago, and the guide was telling me how many hospitals have been built by Chinese money and how many schools have been built. You know, that level of kind of investment everywhere, and therefore it becomes difficult, or at least there is an element of much greater personal risk in taking China on. So it's kind of interesting watching governments try and formulate some kind of way of talking to China.
Absolutely. I mean, Boris Johnson was fairly forthright in what he said about Hong Kong and offering citizenship. And that's quite a change from Osborne and Cameron, who were all over Mr. Jinping and, you know, drinking beer with him and all that. So it is fascinating what it's doing to other powers around the world. You know, does anybody dare pick a fight with China?
Yeah, Trump does on alternate days.
Yes, quite.
You know, no one quite knows where his brain is at the moment.
Armando, I want to just move for a moment away from creative projects. I get the sense that from you that on creative projects, you don't know where the next one's coming from, so it's no good. No,
I mean the process in lockdown, we've been in the process of writing the second series of a show I do for HBO called Avenue 5, which is set in the future, set in 40 years' time, in a sort of space tourism industry. A ship with 6,000 passengers meant to be up in space for 8 weeks. Something goes wrong and they're stuck up for 8 years. And it's fundamentally about and Hugh Laurie, who plays the captain, turns out not to be a captain. He was just appointed because he looked like a captain, and that's all they needed. So it's basically about people trapped in a situation that could kill them with a fundamental lack of leadership. So it's got nothing to do with events now.
Yes, quite. Nonetheless, it does sort of irresistibly lead, you know, that's the cue I wanted, because on behalf of members here who would like to sort of get to know you a little bit, I'd love to just know a little bit more about what you're up to at home in this strange isolation that you've been in for, 3 months. What are you doing? Are you doing, I can't remember how old your children are, homeschooling? Have you become a gardener?
No, thankfully I haven't had to do any of that. Our youngest is 18 next month, so there's been very little of that. We've been doing lots of Zooms. My wife and I are at home with our dogs and my youngest, our daughter. And it's just been, you know, I think as everyone would say, it's had its highs and its lows. You know, we've all known, if not personally affected, we've all, I think, been affected by the tragic side of it. We've all been lifted by the strange sense of community, even though we're all in our separate little locales, over carers and the NHS and key workers and so on. And as I say, I've been kind of fortunate in that it's kind of coincided with a long period of writing that I was all scheduled to do, and writing you can do more or less anywhere. It's not quite the same not being able to have all the writers in a room and to kind of spark off each other, but Zoom has given us something. But I think what I've been doing, I decided early on not to do that kind of super lockdown. I'm I'm going to timetable every day. I'm going to learn Portuguese. I'm going to work out how to build a shed. I'm going to come up with a vaccine. I'm just going to work solidly. You know, I'm going to pack the days with stuff to keep me going. I kind of thought, no, we're here for the long run rather than the short term, that it's a marathon rather than a sprint. And actually the key was to do as little as possible and as slowly as possible. And that would somehow take you through, and try and get to the end of the day not beating yourself up because you haven't done very much. I think I wanted to try and lean in to the kind of open-ended, lengthy process rather than try and run away from it. So that's what I've been doing. And it's just been bizarre. I mean, every day blends into every other day. I think most recently, though, I've been getting more and more, I wouldn't say depressed, but furious with how clear it is how our country is just quite broken at the top, really. And it's not a go at the Tories or anything like that. It's more about just the way our country works or doesn't. You know, that it's over centralized. It relies on a feeling of excellence and expertise that it hasn't quite tested and updated as much as it should. And people, I think politicians who don't know much other than politics, and therefore when real life comes and hits them in the face, they're slightly confused by it. That's my general take on the last 3 months.
Yes, no, well, that's not a very optimistic view.
No, it's not. No, other than maybe, you know, but we're halfway there. In being able to recognise it, we might be halfway there to kind of sorting it out. I don't know.
Yeah, we've got a more plausible leader of the opposition these days. I'm quite encouraged by him.
Yes, but we also have him against a majority of 80. And in this country, if you have a large majority, as Prime Minister, you can do whatever you like with no checks and balances. So that's the situation we find ourselves in. But, you know, who knows where we might be in 5 years' time.
Yes, quite. Well, what else was I going to ask you? I don't think there's anything else I'm burning to ask you. I think this is the moment now for me to have a look at the questions that have come up, and
You've muted yourself, Rupert.
Yeah. Rupert, you need, there we go. Nope, you're muted again.
I'm not doing it. Tim, yes. You're sabotaging me. No, okay, so I'm going to take the questions. I'm not muting myself. I hope you can still hear me. The first question, Tim has created this list for me, and the former chairman of the National Liberal Club, Janet Berridge, is at the top of the list. So, Janet, you have a go with your question for Armando.
Thank you. Hello, Armando. We did briefly at the lunch.
That's right, yes.
Really nice to meet you. It's been very interesting hearing what you've had to say. And you've just said you weren't going to build a shed or learn a language during lockdown. But I mean, you are a very diverse artist. Is there something that you're burning to do apart from writing and television and books and things like that? Is there something really unusual that you still want to do? I mean, you've just admitted your youngest child's 18. The kids are out of the house. What would you like to do in your life apart from all those wonderful things you've already done?
I really love live stuff, and I suppose this is germane to like what's happening now, because you know, live venues at the moment, theatre, music venues, festivals, you know, they're all in serious trouble, and I don't know why the government is reluctant to put any money into supporting them, because I don't think it needs to be very much. I just, you know, in comparison with the amount they put into manufacturing and furloughs and airlines and tourism and hospitality and care, and all those are hugely important. But I keep banging on about how the creative industries in the UK contribute more to our GDP than the oil industry and the car industry together. And yet we have, I think, in politics, this slight reluctance to associate ourselves with the arts, because the arts, we think they might be a little bit clever and a bit privileged, and that doesn't look good. Whereas, if you go to a football match, that looks good. And I don't know why, because, they provide such a lifeline for so many people. And they got us through this. They helped get us through this. What did people do when they were stuck at home? They read, they watched Netflix, they watched a film, they listened to music, so, and it's going to be desperate if when lockdown is over and we get out and they're all gone. So getting back to your question, what I would love to do is actually do something for the stage, or whether it's an opera or a devised piece on. I love live. I love contact with live audiences.
That sounds great, and I quite agree with you. I live in Berlin now, and believe me,
well,
people they're dying to get back into the theatres and the opera houses.
Well, Germany's an amazing example, because there's an opera house in every major city in Germany, and I remember going to the opening night of the season at the Komische Oper in Berlin, and the mayor of Berlin was there because it was the opening night. And you wouldn't get the mayor of London or the prime minister at the opening night of an opera season here, because they just think it looks bad. But if you change that image, if you say no, it's I'm Italian. My father played Verdi and Puccini. You go to Italy, people sing opera out in the streets. They sang them across the balconies when they were in lockdown, because opera was seen as of the people. If we just were able to kind of change this attitude we have to the arts, not as a little add-on, but something that enriches people's lives, irrespective of what their background is and what their circumstances are.
Absolutely, I quite agree. Thank you, Armando.
Pleasure.
Talking heads.
Yeah, there is a terrible sort of default Puritanism. There's a sort of an anti-intellectualism in public life.
You think about the number of phrases we have in the English language for, too clever for your own good, clever dick, highfalutin, there's a sort of antipathy towards anything that requires continuous thought, which I find deeply worrying.
Yes. Now, our next question comes from Isha Hui. Your question to Armando.
Unmuted us.
Isha, there you go. She's unmuted herself and muted herself again. Here she comes. Here you come, Isha. We're listening. We can't hear you.
Nope, I'm not seeing anyone.
Well, I can see Isha, and it doesn't say she's mute, but we hasn't come through.
Mm-hmm.
Trevor Peel maybe Trevor Peel in the interim.
Okay.
All right, shall we try Trevor then?
Hello, Armando.
Hi, Trevor.
Hi. Can I just ask you what you think about the current series on BBC of Alan Bennett's Talking Heads by Nick Heitner?
Oh, interesting. I mean, I've only seen one so far, which was the first one. So I'm kind of, I think it was, I think the one I saw was with, it was the Patricia Routledge one.
Sarah Lancashire?
And
Sarah Lancashire?
No, it was, I'm terrible with names, but
Lady of Letters.
Lady of Letters, that's right. And I thought it kind of stood up. There was still, the odd kind of 80s references still around, kind of surprised that someone, the kind of place names and the particulars stuff. But I thought it still stood up as writing. But I can't comment on the whole thing because I haven't seen the whole thing. So, but what was good was, I think it was the very first, I do know this because I know the people involved in it. It was the very first major drama production in lockdown. And it was a good way of just seeing whether we can get back up on. I mean, the other thing that's happened is that the whole film industry has shut down. I was meant to be shooting Avenue 5 about now, but it's on hold. We're looking at now November. So that's a whole load of other people who are kind of, who can be furloughed because they work from project to project rather than are employees of a company. And that was the first attempt in the middle of lockdown, shot actually, at the peak really about 2 months ago. And they managed very inventively to kind of get it done using pre-existing, I think, EastEnders sets or something. And the actors had to drive themselves in and do their own makeup, and cameras were done remotely, and the director was at home and the producer was at home, but everyone was watching it live on Zoom, and and it just showed I think it was a great way of saying all these talents and skills are still out there and they can be utilized. And for something like that, which is such a kind of iconic project, to give it a kind of new twist, I think was a good thing. But having said that, I haven't seen the rest of them, so I can't comment on the rest. What did you make of them?
I really enjoyed them. I thought they wouldn't travel in time, but as you say, incredibly they did. It was interesting to see the props as well.
Yes. They might actually have stood out as being, they might have given away their dating more if they tried to update some of the words and talk about Zooms and iPads, and so it might have felt slightly out of context and just thrown it actually. So I was interested to see they just stuck word for word for how they've been done in the past.
Okay, so now we're going to try again with Isha.
Okay.
Isha, your chance, I hope. We can't hear you though.
Oh dear.
You seem to be unmuted, but we can't hear you.
Turn up your volume.
Try again, Isha. No,
Okay.
no. Keeps being muted, muting herself. I don't know. Can't hear you. Can't hear you. Sorry, Isha, I'm going to have to move on to John Bryant. We're pretty sure we can hear John Bryant. We usually can. John.
Welcome, Armando.
Hi.
My first question, which I wrote down originally, I've got to try and remember what I said, was basically, given your early near-death experience of joining the Treasury, I was wondering whether you'd ever thought of the comedy possibilities of having a drama set inside the Treasury, just as an economic upset was being created, like the recent pandemic. Whether you thought that was a possibility for a comedy.
Well, having done the thick of it for so long, where we tried to make that the Department of Social Affairs and Communities really cover everything. I think I've been there already, but a lot of people have said to me over the last 3 years, do you want to do a Brexit thick of it, or do you want to do a pandemic thick of it? Do you want to do and my answer is no. Why would I want to spend more time seeing how horrible it all was? And also, I kind of feel we took it for where we wanted to take it. But also, I think about politics is so absurd now and so rapidly changing that I think any attempt to dramatize, whether seriously or comedically, to try and dramatize politics now, by the time you've shot it and made it and put it out, it will already be out of date. Things are changing so quickly that I actually think that the comedians have a better chance of hitting home, are the ones who are responding on a daily basis, immediately, the ones on Twitter and on YouTube and using or manipulating the footage, or John Oliver, who has like a whole team of researchers and who acts in a way like a journalist. I think, especially in America, where Trump is all about not giving you any facts, denying the facts, saying the facts are false, saying all news is false, and all he is about is the event, is the happening, how many numbers, how many people watched me, how many people turned up, what viewing figures did my interview get. That's all he's interested. So he's the entertainer. So it's left to kind of comedians to become the kind of journalists and to actually report the facts. in a funny way. But they're wandering more towards the kind of objective, while the politicians are wandering more to the subjective. And also things like the thick of it were based on the premise that there was an agreed way of doing things. And what we were doing were, in each episode, showing how the rules were bent or compromised or broken. But when Trump can say, you know, I can shoot a guy in the face in the middle of Fifth Avenue and still be elected, then there are no rules. If there are no rules, I can't show you how the rules have been broken because there aren't rules, you know. If Dominic Cumming can say, oh, I drove 40 miles to test my eyes with my wife in the car, who can also drive, and child, as sort of like an airbag, then again, there are no rules. So in answer to your question, I kind of feel I don't think I'm the right person to be dramatizing these events, really, because I don't think the drama will be as interesting and as appalling and as absurd as what the reality is.
So you're basically saying that we ought to have a really decent documentary, which would be the funniest thing of the year.
Yes, yes. If we gave every minister a little kind of cam, like the police have, a little shoulder cam, and just tell them to go about their business, then at the end of the year, we'll have something pretty good to watch, I think.
Okay, I'm going to take another question. Philip,
okay, I think I can talk now.
Come on then.
Yeah. Okay, so basically my question is, I'm David Copperfield. You used the...
Oh no, terrible feedback.
Oh yeah.
Okay. So you used the...
Ah, no.
Some...
No, Isha, I'm
Could
afraid...
you hear me now? Sorry.
Tim's
I
going to
just
block
said
you.
I'm David Copperfield. You used the Indian actor.
Yes.
So with the diversity, could you talk about the casting diversity now on the multicultural things? Could you explain what you're going to continue to use this?
Am I going to continue? Well, I mean, with David Copperfield, first of all, Dev Patel was the only person I could think of to play David. He just, for me, kind of inhabited the spirit of David. That's who I was. That's what someone like him was. What I was looking for, and how I imagined David to be. And I was so glad Dev said yes, because I didn't have a plan B. But having cast Dev, I then thought, well, that's how I must cast everyone in the film. I want to find just the best person who best inhabits the spirit of the character, irrespective of, you know, background, look, training, whatever, really. But also it was important for me. I mean, I said right at the start of this that for me, it was a very modern feeling novel. And for the film, I wanted, yes, it to be set in 1840. We went to all the, we did a lot of research to actually, you know, source the wallpapers and the clothes, the patterns and the dresses that people wore. But on the other hand, I also wanted it to feel now. I wanted it to connect with the audience now. I wanted the audience in the cinema and watching it at home to feel that at any point they stood up and walked into the film, they'd feel perfectly at home, because it's a story that should reflect issues happening now as well as then. On the whole question of, and the phrase is colorblind casting, which I never like because it sounds limiting, and in fact it's color inclusive. I'm saying I want to be able to cast from 100% of the acting community available to me, and I don't want any restrictions. I think that's important. You know, we have such a huge industry in the UK of doing period costume drama. And I think it's just horrible to hear stories of fantastic actors who haven't been able to get parts in them because of the color of their skin. And I hate reading stories of fantastic talents who've had to go to America to get a decent part. So hopefully with the film and you know, it's something that's been going on in theatre for the last 20 years, and no one's better than I. And to be honest, the question of the casting in the film tends to come up from journalists in advance of seeing the film, and then it disappears once they've seen the film, because people leave the film thinking that was a really good cast and I liked everyone in it. So I think that's the way to go ahead. And similarly with writing and so on, when I'm looking for new writers, I ask for things to be submitted, but with names taken off, so there's no sense of gender and addresses as well. So no place, you know, background. I just want to read it, and if it's funny, then I'll be interested. And I think that's, you know, going back to what I was saying about the country. I mean, I also feel there's so much potential in the country, and there's so much that isn't given its due. And I think if we wanted to have a truly level playing field and level up, as Boris keeps telling me, then one way of doing that is to look at, you know, whether unconscious or deliberate restrictions we're putting on people's potential from an early age, and how can we remove that tendency to write people off, or to think that it's not for the likes of them, or that they'll never get the experience, or they'll never get the, you know, because I think I do believe that one of the reasons I wanted to make it David Copperfield was because I wanted to be a very positive film that celebrated what I think of as Britain, which is Britain as being a very generous and kind and creative and funny and diverse place. And that image may have got dented over the last 3 years because of the whole Brexit debate. But I don't think it's gone away. I think that's what we are. And so I wanted the film to kind of celebrate that.
And Armando,
okay, thank you.
Pleasure. Nice to see you again, Isha.
That resonates hugely with all of us at the National Liberal Club. I mean, it's absolutely what we want to stand for.
Yeah.
We you know, a few years ago we decided to call ourselves the most inclusive club in Britain, and that's what we really want to be. And we've started a diversity group to look at ways in which we can do it better, because I'm sure we don't do it, you know, as well as we'd like either. Now, Philip Dutton's been waiting a very long time. I'm glad Isha got through eventually. I think she had to switch machines or something.
Yes.
He got through eventually, and now it's Philip's turn. Philip, your question to Armando.
Thank you. Hi, Armando.
Hi, Philip.
Sorry if this is a bit of a technical question, but
okay.
As I'm a composer of concert hall music, and one thing that I've always found fascinating is that directing is another form of art, actually working with time and timing. And I was wondering, because I found that the timing of Death of Stalin was just impeccable. I loved it. What kind of processes, and whether you could tell me or tell us a little bit about how you go about timing, how much of it is planned before and after?
I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, I could talk for hours on this. I'm sure Rupert will limit me, but especially with the film, TV is different because you've got lots of episodes, and you know, you can come up with an idea that you think, well, it doesn't fit here, but maybe in 3 weeks' time or 3 episodes' time. With a film, you have to carry this whole thing in your head at all times.
Yeah.
The whole shape up. So you put a lot more preparation. You only have one go at it. You can't do a pilot film and then a kind of, you know, you've got one go at it. So I always do a lot of preparation in terms of the script. Now, music is fundamental. I'm a great classical music fan, and I'm always, when I'm writing, I'm always got music playing. And I think when writing the films, I have certain kind of demo pieces of music playing. So in Death of Stalin, there was lots of shots of Kolbich and Weinberg, which our composer Christopher Willis then, you know, I then took off, and Christopher Willis gave it its whole new sheen, but inspired by those pieces. But I think I'm amazed that in film and television, very often music is the last thing that's even thought about. That they go out and shoot it, they light it, they rehearse it, they, you know, cast it, go in, spend months editing it, and then at the last minute the composer's brought in, given not very much time to look at it, and then suddenly write something, and they stick it on and it goes out. And that appalls me, because I think the music is another voice in the piece. The music is one of the cast. You know, it's as important as the rest of the cast or the costume or the design. or the editing. So I'm always, especially at the start of the editing process, I'm always cutting with music in mind, or with a certain rhythm in mind. And you talk about rhythm. I mean, there is a rhythm to a film. I always think of a film as almost like being like a symphony, in that it does have these movements and things start referring back to each other. There is a sort of musical structure to a film, I think, which is what I was saying about having to watch it in one, you know, while you carry the memory of what's gone before, and whether it's developed or repeated or a variation of it happens. There's something subconsciously going on there about being aware of the pattern and shape it is. I mean, if you want to get me really going, I think there is a kind of parallel between comedy and music, in that there is a musicality to jokes, and that, you know, if you get two comedy writers in a room, they will argue for hours about whether the funny word should go at the end of the line or the middle of the line, and somehow where you place the word, it makes it either funnier or less funny, and you can't explain why. There's something to do with just the rhythm of it, and I think there is the kind of chimes with that subconscious part of ourselves that responds to, you know, rhythm and melody and repetition and variation and all those things. Anyway.
Okay. Thank you very much, Philip, for the question. And Armando, I'm going to try and keep the questions coming, because there are lots of people queuing up with questions. The next is Ben Westlake.
Good evening, Armando. Good evening, everybody.
Hi.
Hi. Now you touched on this a little in your answer to John Bryant. I saw your BBC Hard Talk interview the other day, and this question came into my mind then. It's an absolutely excellent interview. I think people will be able to find it on the iPlayer, I imagine.
Thank you.
Now, I'm a classical musician, and we have our own questions to answer about the value of classical music in our society. But as a satirist, with an environment perhaps moving towards a sort of expected correctness in the way we speak and interact, do you think the arts as a whole should be encouraged to keep its platform for free expression and accept that this is very valuable?
Oh, absolutely.
And sorry, I've just finished so that I don't come back. I'd really like you to explain your thoughts on this. And secondly, on this line, although I haven't given this much thought, how about adapting 1984 with Cambridge Analytica?
Well, I don't think you need to adapt it. I just think it's a whole new novel, isn't it? Really, you know. And I am thinking long and hard and reading a lot and around the whole data information, the status that Facebook and, you know, the big companies have, their kind of belief that fundamentally, because they're kind of decent, aren't they, they should be able to do what they like, which, you know, is flawed anyway, but kind of implies that they'll stay decent. You know, what happens when they die and someone else takes over? Will they be decent? So that idea of the, you know, the power and control and their inability to see themselves as publishers, and therefore which lets them off the hook of claiming any responsibility for anything that goes on their platform. All of those things. Now, and not least of which is social media's tendency to magnify any kind of verbal faux pas anyone makes at any point, and the kind of mob justice that then rains down on them. I find that a deeply worrying thing. And there's two things here. I think we can all generally accept that over the last 10, 15, 20 years and over the last few centuries, you know, attitudes have changed, they've grown, they've developed, you know, in terms of history, slavery, obscenity, racism, all sorts, you know, the treatment of women, portrayal of women in art, you know, all you know, there is a I think general understood idea, and therefore, you know, if you go back and start using the language that was used 20 or 30 years ago in something and just say, well, it's just a joke, I think people can see how that doesn't work, how actually you're no longer funny if you're using that kind of language, because you know, one thing about writing comedy is that you write stuff, hopefully, that will make people laugh. And if people aren't laughing, you can't just then go, well, it was a joke. God, you can't say anything these days. I think it indicates it's not a very good joke. So there is that, and I kind of agree with that. I kind of agree that, you know, our language changes and so on. But I don't think we should go back and adjudicate on people from 100 years ago, 150 years ago, based on the kind of the agreed values we have now. In that, you know, talking about Charles Dickens, somebody was scrawled some graffiti on a house of his in Broadstairs saying that he was a racist because of some of the things he wrote. He was a terrible misogynist with his treatment of his wife was disgusting, you know. But I didn't know him. I have no idea what he was like on a day-by-day basis, you know. But he wrote these wonderful books that were all about humanity and all about generosity and you know, liberal values. And, you know, I would hate to think that they must disappear in the kind of attempt to reappraise Dickens' private behavior. I do worry that what's happening on social media, though, is it's also chipping away at our ability to talk to people who have a different point of view, in that it's so easy, if someone has a different point of view, it's so easy now just to block them, mute them, unfollow them, call them out. And what's been happening is we're all been gravitating into these clusters of people who think similarly to us and diverging from people who don't. And it then means we're all in these separate groups. Look at how politics has grown into kind of extremes on the left and the right. And if you want to have some kind of meeting in the middle, then you're going to have to be able to at least talk to each other, to at least agree to be in the same room, metaphorically. I also think that if somebody says they're offended by a joke, you know, my instinct is to say, okay, but what's wrong with being offended? I'm not saying it's right to be offended, but I'd like to know what's wrong with being offended. You know, if you have, say, a religious belief, if somebody tells a joke about it, it should be able to withstand the joke. You know, the strength of your beliefs should be able to withstand a joke. And if they can't, then it doesn't sound like they're that firmly held in the first place. But also, you can only test your beliefs if you're able to argue them through with someone. So for all these, you know, again, I could talk for hours on it, but
you could, Armando. I don't doubt it. And I'd just like at the point to cut you short, because there are so many people who still want to ask questions. So before we get too deeply into religion, I'd like to ask Philip Murphy to chip in with his question.
Amanda, I've got a theory that history as drama only ever really works as black comedy, and so I love Death of Stalin. And I wondered whether you'd been influenced in any way, and whether indeed you even saw it, by Jack Gold's 1983 Channel 4 film, Red Monarch, about Stalin's inner circle. It's one of those films that sort of disappeared.
Yes, no, I did watch it. It had an Irish Stalin, didn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, no, that was because at the time I was thinking, you know, how should they speak?
Yeah.
Should we have them doing, you know, called European Russian accents? And I decided against it, because on the basis that at the time it was the Soviet Union, it was an empire, it was more than just Russia. Stalin was Georgian, so he could speak in a whole other language. Beria was Georgian, Khrushchev was Ukrainian. There were so many accents and dialects and languages being spoken in the Kremlin that it would be far better to have a variety of English, but English accents. So I did Irish, I did American, I did Jason Isaacs did Yorkshire for Zukov, and so on. And I can remember watching that film and finding it interesting that he was Irish, and that it sort of worked. That I didn't balk at it. I didn't think, why is he speaking an Irish accent? No, I remember that. Yeah, he was quite mad, from what I remember. Quite mad.
Okay, again, I'm not sure that many people will have seen that particular Gold film, so perhaps we can move on to Angela. Thank you, Philip, and over to Angela.
in view of what you said, not just immediately, but the time before about the humour, how do you feel about people finding it funny at the expense of other people's embarrassment when they call that humour?
Well, I always find with these things that you can only judge it on a sort of individual instance. I mean, with me, I'm always saying, if it's funny, was it well written? You know, how much effort went into coming up with a joke? Do you mean people's embarrassment in real life as opposed to?
No, what I'm talking about is when they have a program of people, a set of people, and the audience are meant to find it funny when that person is embarrassed and made belittled.
Right.
And it's called humour.
You'd have to give me specific. I mean, I'm very loath to make general sort of judgments.
I think Angela's talking about, you know, belittlement and embarrassment at the same time, because I mean, where would we be without the comedy of embarrassment? You know, that's a staple of English.
Well, I mean, I go back to what I say. You know, is it witty rather than cruel? You know, is it? I always kind of bulk it kind of gratuitous humor. I don't know if that comes into your category, in that, because it feels lazy. You know, when people say, "Oh, you can say anything now," and therefore I'm just going to say anything, I always feel that material is in danger of sounding lazy because there's been no strength. And I find the sharpest comedy is usually comedy that tries to find the level of acceptability and then occasionally steps over it to see what happens. But if you put if you just waded through it and burst it open and just decided everything was going to be non-stop, swearing and abuse and insult, I think that would get very repetitious and therefore not funny. And I'm much more interested in the borderline between acceptable and unacceptable, and occasionally testing it, sending someone out into the kind of the unacceptable no man's land to see what happens to them.
You might be tickled, Armando, to know that one of a good friend of the Liberal Club was uncertain about asking you to be an honorary member because he thought that it wasn't, all this swearing wasn't that funny, and actually, I mean, I think swearing can be quite funny, and with Peter Capaldi in the thick of it, it's very funny. Because, you know, it's the stage where it's incredibly funny. It's so absurd.
Well, I'd say to their credit, I'd say it's not the swearing itself, because I was worried if it was just the same word again and again and again with nothing else, that's terribly dull. I wanted the swearing in because it reflected at the time what I was finding out about how that world worked. But in order to make it funny, it's the words around the swear words that, you know, the added words, the kind of imagery that we put around the swearing that I think allows us to use the swearing.
Yes, I'm sorry, I intervened, and that's
no.
There's another questioner who's Lynn Featherstone. So, Lynn, would you like to unmute yourself and ask Armando?
Yes, I have unmuted myself. I hope I have unmuted.
Yes, you're very unmuted.
Obviously, I'm a politician, so I love the thick of it. But my question, which I put on the chat thing, is how do you get ideas? But because now I want to write, and what I really mean is I have lots of ideas. So how do you know and how do you test what might be a runner? I mean, with the thick of it, how did you know that was going to be the brilliant thing it was? Or
oh gosh, well, thank you very much. But I had no idea. It was all a bit of an experiment, really. We did it very, very cheaply. It was BBC 4 had just started. And if you remember, it was a very low budget station. I went to Roly Keating, who was the controller of BBC 4, and said, I'd like to do a kind of an updated Yes Minister, but maybe reflecting politics. I saw it.
Following that huge success that you had, now, how do you test your ideas? How do you suss whether what do you do in your study to see if they're a runner?
Well, I always collaborate, and I find it's always useful if you have someone else to just tell your ideas to, because there's something to do in the telling of them, especially if it's a fresh pair of ears. You can suddenly tell whether it feels a little bit of a strain or actually whether it feels quite good, you know. and if they're laughing, then you think, oh, good, we're onto something. But if they've kind of stopped laughing for a bit as you have to explain something, it's a bit complicated, then part of you is thinking, I think I'll have to go back and simplify that and make that clearer. And what I do, you know, it's, and also we try stuff out all the time when we're filming. So we always shoot more than I need, so that in the edit, I can try various things in the edit and see if they work. But I always say to kind of writers, always write about what it is that gets you worked up. It might be in a good way or a bad way. If it gets you angry, or if it gets you annoyed, or if it gets you passionate and excited, that's the thing you should be writing about, because I think that will bring out the kind of creative juices, really.
Okay, so it's your fault if I'm not a success. I'll take your advice.
Just surround yourself with people to kind of test your ideas on.
So look, Armando's got to leave us at 7:15. Warn me of that. So I'm going to try and squeeze as many in as possible. Sheila McGurk is next on my list. I hope she's still there. Sheila?
I am here.
Hello. Hi, Sheila.
Hello. Unfortunately, you've probably already covered my original thoughts. The first being that you've already covered, it was all about lockdown, obviously, and the COVID pandemic. So you've said your HBO program, by coincidence, actually is a metaphor or a parable for what we're all going through.
Yes.
You've also said that you would leave it just it's got to be kept current. So I take you to mean somebody like Michael McIntyre is probably the right person to be doing gigs about the current coronavirus situation, COVID situation. But do you think longer term there is material there, when hopefully we've got through it, that could be funny?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I also think that, you know, a subject isn't belittled by being the subject of a comedy. I think comedy allows you to look at a subject from an unexpected or an unusual angle. You know, look at the whole business of Matt Hancock saying, you know, I guarantee by the end of the month we'll have 100,000 tests. And, you know, surprisingly, on the day itself, the last day of the month, it went up from 40,000 to 100,000. And he tweeted a picture of him and his kind of aide by a whiteboard with numbers all adding up to more than 100,000, big thumbs up and so on. And then you analyze it and you realize they'd spend more time just working out how they could get that number on a whiteboard by just putting tests in the post. And, you know, and there's something absurd about that, but it's also deeply tragic. And, you know, you are allowed to touch on tragedy in comedy, because so often the things that cause these terrible consequences arise out of the most ridiculous sets of behavior or sets of circumstances. So yes, there will be many, many jokes to come about this pandemic, I can assure you.
Thank you, Sheila. And so next, Kate Birch. Kate?
Yes, hello.
Hi, Kate.
Hello. We met at lunch. How are you?
Nice to see you.
As a Canadian, I grew up in the 1970s with both British and American comedy. I think it's probably made us a little bit schizoid and may have even led to Lauren Mitchell's and Michael's, and Saturday Night Live. Yeah. But I wonder how you found it, because of course you worked on Beep and On the Thick of It, both political comedies, but both completely different from different countries.
Well, I think that's also been impacted by the fact that over the last 10 years, it's now been easy to access other countries' work, you know, on Netflix. BBC stuff ends up on Netflix, as does American. You know, for the last 10, 15 years, we've been watching Scandinavian crime. And therefore that sense of different, when I went out to do Veep, I was worried because he was as a whole set of Brits coming out to America and making fun of their political system. How would we feel if, you know, a French company came over to London and said, we're going to have we'll go at Whitehall? How would we feel about that? And in fact, I found that a lot of the jokes, a lot of the circumstances were, translated. But also, I found that America was actually a very generous country in that it welcomes ideas. It's all it's after is good stuff. It doesn't matter where it comes from. And I found actually a lot of Americans telling me maybe needed someone to come in from outside because they'd so grown up in this partisan atmosphere of Democrat Republican, whether it was your state or the congressional district you grew up in, the household you grew up in. You're so marked out by whether you're Democrat or Republican that it kind of needed someone who was neither to come in and point out where this kind of logjam had occurred, really. So I feel less that we have all sorts of different styles of humor. I suppose it's more like, in dialect. I mean, we have lots of different micro humors around the country. Glasgow sense of humor is very different from the London sense of humor, I'd say, but it's still fundamentally part of a national kind of conversation we have about ourselves. And similarly, I think internationally, I think there's a lot that we recognize in each other. And I think that's partly because we've also now much more adept at kind of watching output from other countries and don't think twice about it. So it feels much more natural. So I think we're much more comfortable in each other's comedy now.
Lovely, thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Can we move on to Ella, who's dialing in from the Isle of Man, or zooming in from the Isle of Man?
Hello,
Ella.
can you hear me? Yeah.
Oh, hello. Hello.
Hello. I worked at the BBC in the 1960s, so I did 10 years of drama production, and I worked with Innes Lloyd and Alan Bennett and lots of these people like Ken Loach and
oh yes, yeah,
who've done so well now. And
yes.
Sue Lloyd, I don't know if she's on this Zoom tonight, but the widow of Innes Lloyd actually belongs to the Liberal Club now.
All right.
But I'm retired now. I live on the Isle of Man, but I used to go to London every month to do theatres and operas and
yes.
And during the lockdown, I've been watching lots of plays on YouTube and live screening. So do you think that when this is over, that we'll be able to continue to watch things just on our own television at home, but pay-per-view?
I think so. I mean, that has got a big audience now because of circumstances. The National Theatre have been putting their productions up and other theatres have. Unfortunately, it's not bringing in much money, because they're putting it up more or less for free. They're asking for donations, but it's not going to save them. What's going to save them is some cash from the government right now to get theatres through the next 2 or 3 months. Because otherwise, if they don't, 70% of theatres aren't going to be around at the end of the year.
There's nothing quite like a live performance, is there?
No, absolutely. And also, we don't forget that this is also, it's not just the enjoyment of going to the theatre, but it's the breeding ground of the next generation of directors and writers and actors and performers. Don't forget comedy as well, the live stand-up circuit. Your next generation of comedians and so on. This is, this is where they start, and this is what they need. This is the environment they need, and also, it generates so much money for the economy, for the hospitality industry, the tourism industry, and above all, the inland revenue. That I think it's madness really to not, support it financially.
Okay, Nick Strugnall is the next, indeed, at this point, the penultimate questioner.
Hi, just a quick, silly question, really. If you had to do another Death of film,
yes.
who would you pick? Who do you think would be good comedy?
I've just finished a very long history book on Henry VI and the whole kind of Wars of the Roses, which was sort of absurd, really. Maybe the death of Henry VI. Kind of like the idea of going way back. Having a look at that. Sort of a funny Wolf Hall.
Yes. Well, that's a thought.
Yes.
Phil, you at this point, Phil Reeves is going to be our last questioner.
Right, no pressure.
Phil.
Well,
Yeah, come on, make it a cracker.
Armando, thank you for that. Really can't you get away without asking you about Partridge, one of the finest comedy characters ever. And I'm always interested as to how a character like that is created, whether it's created by the actor or whether it's created by the scriptwriter, and what the extent is. And the reason why I ask the question is that the more I've seen of Steve Coogan over the years as he moved away from Partridge, I still keep spotting little verbal tics and tics that take me back to Partridge.
Oh, yeah.
And therefore, I wondered if you could sort of indicate how much of Coogan there was in Partridge at the start, or whether you think rather worryingly Partridge has leached into Coogan over the years or something.
No, I mean, I said early on, I like working with other writers and collaborating. Most of what I do is collaborative, and I like to improvise with other actors and get lots of writers in. And Partridge is one of those examples of something that arose from the collaborative process. I was doing this radio, a parody of news called On the Hour, and it had to sound like the news, but be utter nonsense. I realized I didn't have a sports reporter, and Steve Coogan was part of the cast because I cast people who could do lots of characters and who could improvise as well in character. And I said to him, can you do a sports reporter? Not an impression of a specific one, but have you got a voice that kind of sums them up? And he did this. At the time, it was a slightly more sort of John Watson type kind of voice, but he started talking like that. And everyone else in the room sort of fell about because we kind of knew this person. And instantly, this is to tell you how quickly it happened, instantly someone said, he's Alan. And 2 seconds later, someone else said, and he's a Partridge. He's Alan Partridge. And the more he talked, the more we laughed, because all this guy's kind of sense of kind of young ambition, but at the same time, because he's a sports reporter, you could tell that he worried that the other journalists on the Today program looked down on him as not being like a proper reporter. And then, you know, how he grew up in Norwich. We went for Norwich because no one had ever done Norwich before. There's nothing inherently funny about Norwich. It's just it hadn't been done before. I like Norwich, but it's also quite a bit away from London. So if you're trying to have a local career in Norwich and try and get a foot in the door in London, it's a lot of long driving you have to do. All those elements. So he kind of arose fully formed, you know, like a foal that's just been born. It got up and started walking about. And then Steve gave it this kind of flesh and blood because he's so good at getting under the skin of characters and improvising with them. But he himself said that, you know, there was a lot of Alan in him, not in his attitudes, but his obsession with cars, which was very, very profound at the time. He just channeled into Alan. And he also said that it helped that he didn't know much about sport. So that when he was like improvising as Alan, you could tell that Alan was just kind of making the rules up as he went along. You know, I'm at the boat race, Oxford, Cambridge, but where are the others? Where are the other teams? There's just 2 of them here, way ahead of the other. All that sort of thing. You know, and it was just taking just someone who doesn't, but who's good at talking continuously. That's his, as Alan has said, dead air is a crime when you're a radio presenter. So, and that's what Steve could do. But Steve will always say that there were elements of him and people he knows, you know. And when I worked at the BBC for a long time, and people would always say to me that they work with an Alan Partridge. It's never them. They never say I'm like Alan Partridge, but I know someone who is Alan Partridge. Yeah, so it's a combination of writers and me as producer and Steve. You know, everyone puts their kind of their bit into it, really.
That was great. I've never heard such a good exploration of the Partridge phenomenon. So thanks, Phil, for the question, and thanks, Armando, for the answer. There are a few people who just sort of come in with ideas. A last question. Janet, was there a quickie? Did you have a quickie?
Oh, no.
No. Okay.
Oh, okay. Kate was saying Kate Birch, who you've just spoken to, was saying she's based near Norwich at the moment, and Partridge is Norfolk radio. So I mean, anyway, there's. Armando, look, a big thank you from all of us. This has been absolutely terrific. been great fun. I hope it was slightly more relaxed than your session with Stephen Sacker, but everybody knows now that's been plugged. You can hear more Armando if you
Hard
get
Talk.
Hard Talk, BBC iPlayer, Hard Talk, and for Soft Talk, come to the National Liberal Club.
Yes.
And Armando, we hope you will be back here soon, but
yes, I had all sorts of plans once I'd been inducted. I had all sorts of plans to kind of gad about on a daily basis, but everything's shut down.
We will stay in, and I hope it won't be too long. So a big thank you from me, and for my part, I hope I've whetted everybody's appetite by being in the National Liberal Club, because I'm actually flying to France on Sunday, and I shan't be here for the grand reopening, but Simon will be, and everybody else will be.
I'll be
Phil
there
and
at
Tim
11.
and various others will be first through. Yeah, Tim will be there at 11, and others will be, of course, observing us appropriate social distance, but queuing up in a very civilized way.
And Tuesday table is happening.
Tuesday table is happening. Armando, many thanks, and au revoir.
Well, thank you very much. That was great. Really enjoyed it. Nice to see you all. You're all up in my screen now, so I'll wave.
Great. Thank you, Armando.
See you soon. And good luck in the opening. And everyone, everyone have a splendid super spreader Saturday.